លោកអ្នកនាងមានស្ដាប់ជាទីមេត្រីថ្ងៃនេះយើងមានកម្មវិធីពិសេសដែលយើងនឹងលើកយកកម្មវិធី Idea Talk មកជម្រាបជូនដល់លោកអ្នកនាងមានស្ដាប់នឹងទេសនាជាមុនហើយនឹងយើងនឹងមានព័ត៌មានជាតិនិងអន្តរជាតិជាបន្តទៅទៀតនៅពេលក្រោយបាទខ្ញុំសូមស្វាគមន៍លោកអ្នកនាងមកកាន់កម្មវិធី Idea Talk របស់សារព័ត៌មាន Cambodia Daily ហើយនៅពេលនេះវាគ្មិនរបស់យើងមានអ្នកស្រី Olivia Enos អ្នកវិភាគខាងផ្នែកគោលនយោបាយអង្គការHeritage Foundation នៅរដ្ឋធានី Washington និងលោក Bruce Van Voorhis អតីតបុគ្គលិកនៃគណៈកម្មការសិទ្ធិមនុស្សអាស៊ី Asian Human Rights Commission នៅទីក្រុងហុងកុងលោកអ្នកទាំងពីររូបនឹងពិភាក្សាលើប្រធានបទស្ដីអំពីថាតើសហរដ្ឋអាមេរិកនិងអង្គការសហប្រជាជាតិអាចឲ្យរដ្ឋប្រហារយោធាក្នុងប្រទេសភូមាបរាជ័យដែរឬទេប្រសិនបើលោកអ្នកនាងមានសំណួរឬយោបល់សូមសរសេរនៅក្នុងប្រអប់ comment ខាងក្រោមនៃការផ្សាយរបស់យើងតាមអាស័យដ្ឋាន www.facebook.com/withoutfearorfavorkh យើងខ្ញុំសូមជម្រាបថាយើងខ្ញុំនឹងព្យាយាមសង្ខេបនៅខ្លឹមសារដែលវាគ្មិនទាំងពីរបកស្រាយជូនលោកអ្នកនាងមានស្ដាប់នៅក្រោយកិច្ចពិភាក្សាកម្មវិធី Idea Talk នេះបាទ First of all I'd like to welcome our special guest Mr. Bruce Van Voorhis he is the former Asian Human Rights Commission official in Hong Kong and our regular guest I guess Olivia Enos senior Asia Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome both of you to our program today. Good morning to Bruce and Olivia.
Good morning.
The world has witnessed Myanmar or Burma is headed back to where it was some 20 years ago when the junta leaders felt they lost the elections to the National Democratic League Party and locked up its leader, Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. The generals promised to hold election in 1 year, though. Now that Myanmar is back to square one, Olivia, let me begin with you. Can the U.S. and the UN reverse course in Myanmar from this point on, and how?
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but it's been encouraging to see the Biden administration pressing for some policy reforms, taking a really close look at some of the sanctions policy that the U.S. has in place, and also revisiting and reviewing some of the humanitarian assistance that is out there. It's really awful to see what has happened in Burma over the last several days. I think there had been a lot of hope that Burma would be a bright light, that democratic reform would take root, and that we would see fundamental transformation. And clearly that hasn't happened. I think in terms of next steps, definitely there's a need to reinstitute some of the sanctions that were in place before, but in a more targeted way. That means targeting individual members of the Burmese military, as well as military-owned enterprises that were previously sanctioned, like MEC and MEHL, that we know in many ways fortify the Burmese military's power. But I think sanctions do not a policy make. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and there needs to be continued calls for the release of all political prisoners, both those who are former civilian leaders as well as civil society leaders. And I think we need to really see this administration doing what the last administration didn't do, which is calling a spade and saying that genocide and crimes against humanity were committed by the very same leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and his military cadres against the Muslim minority Rohingya in Burma. So those are just a few steps. I have many other thoughts on other policy things to do, but
okay, I'll follow that up with you. Shortly. Mr. Bruce Van Voorhis, you are an old hand on human rights in Asia, working at different capacities at the Human Rights Commission in Hong Kong, Asian Human Rights Commission in Hong Kong. Can the U.S. and the United Nations do to alter what can it do? They do to alter the course in post-coup Myanmar, returning the country to democracy and securing the release of Aung San Suu Kyi?
I think basically the level of the UN can be like a moral authority for the international community, Already we've seen like Ontario Guterres make statements in support of the people in Burma and the former government in Burma. Naturally, something should happen at the level of the UN Security Council and the UN Human Rights Council. It's highly likely that the governments of China and Russia will probably block any meaningful action that the UN can take. But I think as a voice for the people of Burma, I think the UN can play quite a big role. And at the level in the UN human rights system, like the special envoy for Burma, the special representative on human rights in Burma, these people, I think, can play some role, but it's probably going to be more of a cheerleader for the people than the UN actually taking some meaningful steps. I agree with Livianos that sanctions would be something wise. I know that the Burma Campaign UK has an online petition that people can sign calling for the British government to place sanctions on all the military and military-connected companies in Burma, which would stop British companies from having a relationship with them. And I think this is something the U.S. government and other governments outside, I think Japan and South Korea have a lot of investment in Burma. Yep. And so these, especially Asian countries, I think are key to putting pressure on the military government in Burma.
Okay. The international community appeared to relax for a time its harsh criticism of Burma's human rights records when Aung San Suu Kyi and the generals found political harmony. Aung San Suu Kyi even defended the generals at the International Criminal Court in The Hague for the atrocities committed against the ethnic Rohingya minority. Olivia, you mentioned the crimes against humanity. How can the world come together this time to condemn the military regime as it did before they formed the pseudo-civilian government between the Democratic Party of Aung San Suu Kyi and DL and the junta?
Well, that's a great question, Hassan. I think that, there is a need to just call it what it is. The UN has already said that genocide and crimes against humanity took place against Rohingya. And for whatever reason, the U.S. government has been reticent to say that it is what it is. And so I think that it would be wonderful to see the U.S. working with allies both in Asia and Europe and elsewhere to get other countries to say, yes, these atrocities took place and there's a need for a strong response. I think a lot of times people think that, if you issue an atrocity determination, then nothing happens after that. But the reality is that when you actually say this is genocide, this is crimes against humanity, it helps to galvanize support from people all across the globe to meet the vast humanitarian needs that have only increased. There's between 800,000, I think, to 1 million displaced just in Bangladesh of Rohingya refugees. And so I think, further follow-on steps, both in response to the coup, but also in response to these atrocities that have been going on, would be to extend priority to refugee status so that we can resettle some of them here in the U.S. and perhaps some other countries will follow suit. But one thing I would say is that, now that Senior General Min Aung Hlaing has the vast and immense amount of power that he presently holds due to the coup, we need to also be on alert that the military might not carry out other atrocities inside of Burma, especially against other ethnic minorities in Shan and Kachin state, where there's historically been persecution, and even for Rohingyas that are left behind in IDP camps or back in Rakhine state. So I think we have to be on alert for sure, because the military is enjoying an all-time high in terms of power.
Okay. Bruce, in October 2009, you talked to Voice of America on the UN International Day in support of victims of torture, urging the UN to set higher standards for member states. You said, and I quote here, if you have countries on the UN Human Rights Council that are basically practicing widespread torture, what hope do people living in the rest of the world have? End of quote. My question is, do you hold the view that Burma is still regarded as one of the unrepentant human rights violators?
Yeah, I mean, human rights violations in Burma haven't stopped even under the NLD. Olivia's pointed out the Rohingya issue, and many of the ethnic groups, the Karen and Kachin and so forth, have been fighting for decades and seeking some kind of federal democracy in Burma. Yeah. And none of that has changed even under the NLD government in the last 5 years. So one of the problems I feel in Burma in the last 5 years, when we thought there was some hope for democracy in the country, it was kind of a false hope, because the military still had a lot of power under the 2008 Constitution that they drafted. And so the military has a quarter of the seats in the parliament. They're the ones that make all the decisions regarding defense and border security and the police and so forth. So in many ways, Aung San Suu Kyi's government basically had a lot of their hands tied behind their back regarding security in the country. And so the human rights violations kept going on, and the Rohingya issue was probably, the worst, that's happened. But this doesn't take away from the suffering of the Karen people and Kachin people and so forth, that's gone on for decades. So, things never really improved in Burma regarding human rights.
Do you see any way that the United States some allies in Europe can convince its allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea, as you mentioned, that have interest in Burma, to try to, withdraw its business or divest, in that country because of the human rights violation, and return to dictatorship? Or Bruce, can you say that a little bit about?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think businesses look for in a country is how strong is the rule of law in the country, because this doesn't just affect political issues, but also economic and business issues. If you have some kind of business disagreement with a local partner, can you feel assured that you'll get a fair hearing in the court system within that country? Obviously, especially under the military now in Burma, you're not going to have a really functioning legal system in the country. And so if I was a Japanese business or some business from Singapore or South Korea or someplace, this could potentially be quite worrying, that if I have some disagreement with my Burmese partner or the government, that I'm not going to lose all my assets or in the country and so forth. So I think this is one argument that could be made to, say, the Japanese and South Korean governments. And I think both of those governments, especially South Korea, has, I would say, a pro-democracy, pro-human rights president now, that they would be open to supporting the people in Burma. I think something that needs to be looked at, how can the military be separated from big brothers in China and Russia? Because for me anyway, looking at the situation, I feel the outside obstacles to any change in Burma are the Chinese and Russian governments. And I was kind of surprised in the last couple of days reading that now Russia is selling more military equipment to Burma than the Chinese. So it seems like the Russians are playing a bigger and bigger role in Burma than they have in the past.
I see. Some form of sanctions was imposed on a number of Burmese generals by former President Donald Trump. Olivia, do you see more tougher sanctions on the way under President Joe Biden? Can sanction alone change the hearts and minds of the coup leaders?
So I think that we probably will see additional sanctions, and I think the ideal scenario would be for there to be a reinstitution of basically calling it a state of emergency, using the authorities of IEPA for Treasury that would enable them to reimpose some of the Jade Act sanctions that Congress had granted to the executive branch in previous times when Burma was really experiencing backslides in democracy. But I think that, the sanctions that we need today are actually more effective than a lot of the historic sanctions because they are more targeted in nature. That means that you hold the individuals and the companies and the entities that are responsible for carrying out these abuses directly accountable while still creating space for the people themselves to be able to operate. So I don't think having a broad-based trade embargo, a la a Cuban embargo would be very helpful because I think the Burmese people need the space to be able to mobilize. That means they need to have livelihoods and they need to be able to engage in business and whatnot. And so I think we are going to see additional sanctions. And if the Biden administration, for whatever reason, didn't have the political will to do so, I think there's sure a lot of interest in Congress that will press the hand of the administration to act. But at the end of the day, I don't think you're going to change the mind of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. We can't know his direct motives for why he decided to engage in a coup. He's given a couple of reasons. People have suspected that it's because he had a retirement on the horizon and maybe wanted, greater power at the end of his life. So I doubt we'll change their hearts and minds, but we can send a clear message to the Burmese people that the U.S. government cares to protect their rights and safeguard their freedoms. And so I think that's what we need to be focused on, and that's the messaging our policy should send.
Is there any debate on Capitol Hill these days, about Burma?
Yes, definitely. I think that there's, consideration of reintroducing the Burma Act, which had been spearheaded by Eliot Engel in the last Congress on the House side. And I think, there's potential for, other forms of sanctions legislation that might be on the horizon. I think there's definitely political will in Congress to do so, particularly for those members that have Burmese American diaspora living in their districts. And so I think that we'll potentially be seeing action on that front, but I think it remains to be seen. But I think Congress has long had a special place in their hearts for the Burmese people and for fostering and safeguarding democracy there. So I think that everybody feels motivated to act in this moment.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you think Aung San Suu Kyi should form another government with the generals, knowing what they did to her a few times in the past?
I think it's unlikely that something like that will be possible, but I guess you can never say never. I think it really remains to be seen. And, to an earlier point that we were discussing, I think that especially Western governments, including the U.S., had pinned a lot of hope on an individual, on Aung San Suu Kyi herself. And I think in many ways we had falsely assumed that Aung San Suu Kyi was a pro-democracy advocate rather than a politician. And by pro-democracy advocate, we had assumed also this vision that all the human rights and the civil and political freedoms that we typically think of when we advocate for democracy would be a part of that. But of course, we've seen Aung San Suu Kyi, defending what the military carried out against Rohingya. And so I think we should be cautious, and this should be a lesson to U.S. policymakers, never to pin our hope on one person and never to assume things that aren't explicitly stated by that person themselves.
Okay. Bruce, similar question. Can sanction alone, however tough, change the hearts and minds of the authoritarian leaders in Yangon or Rangoon? is the world going to lend unwavering support to the locals and sustain pro-democracy protests?
I would like to think that the world will support the people in Burma as long as it takes to change this military government and so forth. I think, there's a couple other tools that could help, like an arms embargo. There may have been one already I'm not aware of. And again, I go back to the Chinese and Russians selling weapons. They're probably not going to honor any international arms embargo. But I think if there is a new call for an arms embargo, that how can it be enforced, or how can it have some teeth that especially the Russians and Chinese would feel some pressure if they went against the embargo. Something I've been thinking about in the last day, but this would probably affect the whole economy and would obviously then negatively impact the people. But in looking in some of the subsidiaries of the Miramar Economic Holdings and Miramar Economic Corporation, that are the big conglomerates that the military controls in the country, is that there's a number of banks that come under these conglomerates. And what if these banks were not able to access US dollars or euros or yen and hopefully other major economies in the world? This would put a big squeeze, I think, on the Burmese economy. What if there was, in addition to an arms embargo, like an oil and gas embargo? This would also, again, affect the whole economy and would hurt the people, probably as well as the generals. But long time ago, back in the 80s, when we were talking about sanctions in South Africa, I heard a woman speak in the U.S. from the African National Congress, and she was asked this question about sanctions and how it would affect the people. And she said, people in South Africa are willing to die for their freedom. You think they're worried about losing their job? And I think, we in the West, when we think about hurting the people, we're quite considerate of hurting people's jobs and lifestyles and livelihoods and so forth. But you can see the protest in just the last few days all over Burma against the coup. And so, people are risking a lot going on to the streets now. And so they may welcome as much international pressure that can be put, even if they're going to suffer from it. It's not my place to say, this is good or bad, but it is something that's there that could be used to put a lot of pressure on the military. And I also read that one of the motivations for the coup is what Olivia also said about Min Aung Hlaing's supposedly retirement.
It's reaching retirement age?
65. But
still young.
Also another rationale is he doesn't want to retire, not just because of power, but because he wants to protect his and his family's economic interests. So I think that's another weakness that he has that the international community should look at. How can we put pressure to affect especially him and his family's businesses in the country? So,
And if I could just add to,
I
please, think, to Bruce's point about the military-owned banks, I've wondered whether or not Treasury might have the authority to designate any of those banks as a primary money laundering concern, as we did in the case of North Korea with Banco Delta Asia, a bank in Macau that was laundering money for the Kim regime. I have almost no doubt, although I guess I don't have the evidence, right at my fingertips, that those banks are used for money laundering purposes to enrich and line the private coffers of the Burmese military. And so I think this may be a tool. That tool was incredible because, as Bruce said, being cut off from the financial system or being cut off from the principal banks that you rely on for your funding, it can have quite a chilling effect on the activities that you engage in. And so I think that's something that if Treasury and State Department are not looking at that presently, it might be something to add in to their sanctions review.
Right. I have a question here. Got a question from our listener, a viewer, for Olivia. Can Burma, the issues of Burma, lead to U.S. and conflict with China in any form, any way?
Yeah, there's always concern about China's role in any Southeast Asian country. And I think the reality is that, with any country in Southeast Asia, we have talked about this before in the context of Cambodia, no country is going to choose between investment and opportunities from the U.S. and China. The reality is that they're going to engage both. And so I don't think that it's the U.S. policymakers' role to try to discourage them from taking money when they know full well what the potential risks are to that. I don't foresee any sort of military conflict over what's going on in Burma, but I definitely do see potential loss of leverage in terms of trying to influence better policies going forward. But I'll be honest with you, I think that when the Obama administration revoked sanctions, hopeful that democracy was on the horizon, they already sacrificed a significant amount of leverage in the country. And so now the question is, can this, albeit horrible incident, be an opportunity for the U.S. to be able to better influence policy and to create additional space for the Burmese people to be able to act in a way that also sidelines the military and the authority that they have they've really power grabbed over the last several years. And I think that did, in many ways, hamstring any efforts at reform that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD government might have wanted to undertake.
Hassan, can I add a quick point here?
Please, Bruce.
The new Biden administration has said that the U.S. is back and that they want to re-engage with our allies and so forth around the world. And I hate phrasing the coup as an opportunity, but for the U.S. government and the new administration, it's a way for the new administration to reinforce those past links that got diluted in the last 4 years, with allies in Europe and allies in Asia like Japan and South Korea and India and Singapore, to work on this issue of Burma. And so from the U.S. government standpoint, especially the new administration, I think this is a possibility to show that the U.S. is back, so-called, and that it does really want to work with the international community to solve, these major international issues that come up. So I think the Biden administration should take this as a way to re-engage the U.S. And be, once again,
Southeast
one
Asia.
of the leaders in the world.
Right.
So.
I always hear a counter argument that any arms embargo or sanctions of any kind on a regime in that part of the world, it's not going to hurt the leaders, the generals. It's going to hurt the average citizens, people. How can we balance that between like doing nothing and doing something, or a tougher sanction in this case against the coup plotters? How can we balance that, Bruce?
I think I go back what I said earlier about the example of the ANC in South Africa and so forth, that again, the people, they're suffering already. So, and they've been poor already for decades, and the government, whether it was the military government in Burma or the NLD in the last 5 years, people have remained poor. So in many ways, they don't have a lot to lose, and what they want to gain is their freedom and their human rights. So they may be willing to take a lot more suffering that we would consider suffering from the outside than we would, you could say. And I think, as Olivia said, targeted sanctions that affect the military and their family members. I mean, they take away their ability to travel, even to places like Singapore, which are nearby, as well as Europe, North America, etc. I'm sure they've taken a lot of their money outside the country someplace, whether it's Singapore, Switzerland, the Bahamas, whatever.
The common islands.
If the cards fall down, they want to be able to leave, and they want to have a nest egg someplace to live quite comfortably. So wherever they have their money overseas, these banks should freeze their assets, and it may be property too, because then that's, it's cleaner, this kind of thing. So I think the military, as individuals and as an institution, can be affected, because I think their weakness is they have to rely on their businesses to generate money to prop themselves up. So the question is, how do they lose money, basically? This is, I think, a strategy that should be used.
Right. Olivia, anything you like to add?
I think Bruce covered it really well. I mean, I think those targeted sanctions really are key. They're so different. I want to underscore that they're so different from the sanctions that were used 20 years ago. And I think that those tools, they're much sharper, they're much more direct. And I think, one sort of cautionary note I would make is that I know that some people have said that we have to be careful which military-owned enterprises we target. Some of them will have a greater impact on military members specifically, and some may have the potential to harm the economy more broadly. And so I think that as the Biden administration is undertaking the sanctions review, it should make sure that it targets those entities that most directly impact the military and mitigate harms to the people if possible. But of course, as Bruce said, some of the people may be willing to have a little bit of economic hardship in exchange for greater space to be able to operate and press for democracy and human rights. So 100% agree, Bruce.
Okay. Can this issue of Burma be a good case study for pro-democracy advocates? Olivia?
I think it's a cautionary tale that we shouldn't sacrifice our leverage too soon or too quickly. I think that the optimism that was present in the Obama administration really did sacrifice longstanding leverage and create space for the military to really abuse its power. I think also there's a real need to do a close, hard look in the mirror when it comes to the democracy assistance that we've been offering to Burma, because clearly either it didn't work or it was too small of a scale or something along those lines. And so I think there's a broader need for an overarching policy review. This is something I've been advocating for actually since the Rohingya crisis, that we need to take a close look in the mirror and evaluate some of these different programs that are out there to make sure that they're working well. Because I think, unfortunately, a lot of leverage was sacrificed, and now the Burmese people are the ones that are suffering as a consequence.
Olivia, thank you very much. Olivia Enos, Senior Asia Policy Analyst at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Bruce Van Voorhis, former Asian Human Rights Commission official in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your thought, your experience, and thank you for making time for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Please come back again. Sure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day. លោកអ្នកនាងមានអ្នកស្ដាប់នឹងទស្សនាកម្មវិធីជាទីមេត្រីអំបញ្ញមិញនេះជាកិច្ចសម្ភាសន៍ពិសេសទាក់ទិននឹងបញ្ហាដែលកើតមាននៅក្នុងប្រទេសភូមាឬក៏ហៅថាមីយ៉ាន់ម៉ាអ្នកស្រី Olivia Enos គឺជាអ្នកវិភាគគោលការណ៍នយោបាយចាស់ទុំនៅអាស៊ីពីវិទ្យាស្ថាន Heritage Foundation នៅ រដ្ឋធានី Washington លោក Bruce Van Voorhis គាត់លោកជាអតីតមន្ត្រីបម្រើការងារក្នុងសមត្ថភាពច្រើនមុខការជាង10ឆ្នាំហើយលោករស់នៅទីក្រុងហុងកុងលោកមានពិសោធន៍ច្រើនទាក់ទិននឹងរឿងសិទ្ធិមនុស្សនៅតំបន់អាស៊ីអាគ្នេយ៍ជាពិសេសបាទ